I think there were not many people who understood just how broad his interests were and how supportive he was of an astonishingly wide range of organisations.
You told a reporter at around the time of your 70th birthday that actually if you weren't a princess of the United Kingdom, that actually you might well have been an engineer. Do you think you've got that from your father?
I think that's probably true, because I think if anything broke, there was always a man, have a look at this, see if you could mend it. I mean, you didn't throw things away. I mean, I'm that old. That often comes from your own family background.
Long before the palace appeared divided, Anne had allegedly noticed something others dismissed. Her concern was not about one argument or one uncomfortable appearance. It was about a pattern, and when she privately warned senior officials, the response she received would later become almost as controversial as the warning itself. Anne had spent a lifetime inside a system where small details rarely stayed small. She understood the difference between bruised feelings and a problem capable of reaching the heart of the institution. That was why she reportedly paid attention when private expectations began drifting away from public assurances. Requests appeared that seemed harmless in isolation. Questions about access, independence, protocol, and personal freedom surfaced again and again. To others, these were manageable tensions. To Anne, they suggested something unresolved was growing underneath. She did not rush toward confrontation. She did not seek Meghan out or turn the matter into a family argument. Instead, Anne allegedly went through the channels she trusted most, quietly raising her concerns with senior officials whose job was to protect both the family and the crown. Her message was controlled, but unmistakable. These disputes could not simply be allowed to accumulate. The response was cautious. Some officials reportedly believed Anne was reading too much into ordinary friction. Relations involving Harry and Meghan were already sensitive, and any formal intervention risked making matters worse. The palace had spent years surviving tension through patience, silence, and compromise. Why provoke a larger confrontation now? But Anne's concern was not centered on Meghan alone. That distinction mattered. She allegedly argued that the real danger began when private grievances became tangled with royal titles, public sympathy, institutional access, and influence. Once that happened, every disagreement could become something larger than the people involved. Then came the sentence that changed the mood. Once private conflict became public currency, Anne warned. The palace would no longer control the timetable. Some in the room reportedly viewed the language as excessive, even protective of tradition to a fault. Others reacted differently. Quietly, almost without acknowledgement, officials began documenting incidents they had previously dismissed as isolated misunderstandings. Dates were noted. Requests were remembered. Contradictory expectations were compared. Harry, meanwhile, allegedly knew nothing about the seriousness of these internal conversations. From his perspective, the disagreements remained personal and manageable. Behind closed doors, however, a different interpretation was taking shape. One that would eventually place him on the opposite side of decisions he had never known were being prepared. But Anne's warning would have remained another forgotten palace memo if a second development had not forced officials to reopen the very concerns they had chosen to ignore. The first real alarm did not arrive with shouting, accusations, or a dramatic confrontation. It came through a request, private, carefully worded, and seemingly reasonable. Yet according to the palace insiders in this fictionalized account, Anne immediately recognized why granting it could quietly change the balance of power. The request itself was sensitive precisely because it looked ordinary. It allegedly involved a degree of private access, consultation, or participation normally associated with those still carrying formal royal responsibilities. Nothing about it sounded explosive. There was no open challenge to the crown, no demand designed to provoke headlines. That made the decision harder. Several officials reportedly believed approving it might reduce tension and demonstrate goodwill. Anne saw a different danger. To her, the question was never whether one request seemed reasonable. It was what that approval would mean the next time another exception was requested. Royal protocol survived on precedent, and once a boundary moved even slightly, it became far harder to restore. Anne allegedly warned advisers that good intentions could still produce dangerous consequences. Harry, however, reportedly viewed the hesitation through a more personal lens. To him, resistance risked looking like another example of Meghan being treated according to a separate set of rules. What officials considered procedure, he could interpret as rejection. That emotional divide quickly gave the issue a weight far greater than the request itself. Anne refused to let the discussion become about personalities. She allegedly insisted that the same restriction should apply to anyone outside formal royal duties, no matter their popularity, family connection, or public profile. Consistency, she argued, was the only defense against accusations of favoritism. Then, one senior official reportedly identified the real weakness. The palace had never fully defined what happened to certain privileges when a family member stepped away from official service. Meghan remained connected to the monarchy through marriage and family. She remained globally recognized, yet she no longer operated under the same internal obligations. That gap created uncertainty, and uncertainty created conflict. Anne warned that ambiguity was becoming the most dangerous element of all. Grant the request, and critics could call it special treatment. Refuse it, and others could call it punishment. Either way, the palace risked losing control of the meaning attached to its own decision. So officials chose delay. It solved nothing. Harry grew more suspicious. Advisers became more cautious. And the unresolved request began feeding the exact pattern Anne had warned about. And while officials debated one private request, Anne was already looking at something far more sensitive: the question of access, inheritance, and the royal privileges nobody ever discussed in public. Inside the monarchy, the most powerful rules are often the ones never announced. They govern residences, heirlooms, private collections, ceremonial access, and the invisible hierarchy surrounding the crown. Anne allegedly believed those boundaries were being tested, and this time she refused to remain quiet. What had begun as a dispute over access was now moving into far more sensitive territory. Questions emerged about royal property, personal inheritance, ceremonial objects, and possessions carrying generations of emotional weight. Inside the palace, those categories were not interchangeable. Some items could belong privately to individuals. Others, though technically held by a person, were understood to remain within the royal orbit for future generations. That distinction became crucial. Certain jewels, letters, documents, and sentimental objects connected to previous royals allegedly came under quiet discussion. Could they be treated simply as family possessions? Could they leave traditional royal custody? And if they did, who would decide whether that was personal freedom or a loss to the institution itself? Anne reportedly became especially protective of objects associated with Queen Elizabeth II and Princess Diana. She understood how quickly a necklace, a handwritten note, or a private keepsake could stop being an object and become a symbol. In a family already carrying unresolved pain, symbols could become weapons without anyone intending them to. Officials were deeply uneasy. Any conversation involving Diana risked reopening emotional wounds, particularly because Harry's connection to his mother remained intensely personal. Even raising questions about ownership could be interpreted as exclusion. Anne's reported answer was stark. Emotional inheritance was not always the same as legal ownership. That distinction may have been logical, but it was also dangerous. It meant that something could feel deeply personal to Harry while still being governed by rules he did not control. A confidential inventory review allegedly followed. On paper, it was administrative. In reality, it became a symbol of the entire conflict. What belonged to one person? What belonged to royal history? And who had the authority to make that judgment? Harry reportedly began to suspect Anne's influence was shaping more decisions than he had been told. Frustration hardened into distrust. The bureaucracy he already resented now seemed to have a face. Anne saw the situation differently. To her, this was proof of the warning she had issued from the beginning. Private hurt was no longer staying private. It was colliding with inheritance, status, memory, and the machinery of monarchy. But the deeper Anne pushed into the palace's unwritten rules, the more one uncomfortable question emerged. Who had known about these tensions before she ever issued her warning? Anne believed she was delivering new information. Then she discovered something more disturbing. Several officials were not surprised. They had allegedly seen pieces of the same pattern months earlier, but no one had connected them. Or perhaps no one had wanted to admit what those pieces might eventually become. The discovery changed Anne's understanding of the entire situation. Scheduling teams had recorded disagreements over appearances. Protocol staff had noted questions about precedence and access. Communications advisors had dealt with conflicting expectations over what could be announced, denied, or left unanswered. Security officials had their own concerns. Each department had seen something. Yet each had treated its problem as separate. That was the weakness. No single incident looked serious enough to justify alarm. A delayed response here. A disputed arrangement there. A private frustration passed between offices. On their own, they appeared to be ordinary consequences of a difficult family transition. But when Anne began placing them beside one another, the pattern looked harder to dismiss. Her anger was not based on the belief that officials had deliberately concealed the truth. The problem was more unsettling than that. The palace had become so skilled at containing individual problems that nobody had stopped to ask whether those problems belonged to the same larger conflict. Some advisors pushed back. They feared Anne was connecting events that had never been connected in the first place. If every misunderstanding became evidence of a pattern, they warned, the palace could manufacture a crisis simply by trying too hard to prevent one. Others were beginning to agree with her. They believed ambiguity had already become dangerous. Worse, Harry was allegedly receiving reassurance from one part of the institution while another quietly tightened boundaries. One office might tell him that family relationships remained unchanged. Another might deny access on procedural grounds. From inside the system, those decisions could make sense. From Harry's position, they could feel like contradiction. Meghan reportedly interpreted the mixed signals even more sharply. To her, they suggested that different palace factions were pulling in different directions, some sympathetic, others determined to restrict her influence. Anne saw a more troubling possibility. Perhaps there was no coordinated campaign at all. Perhaps the institution itself was simply avoiding a conversation nobody wanted to have. And every attempt to delay that conversation was increasing the suspicion around it. The warning she had once delivered as a precaution was becoming something far harder to control. The palace was no longer managing tension. It was feeding it through uncertainty. And then, a private exchange reached Anne that changed the dispute completely. Because, for the first time, the argument was no longer simply about protocol, It was about trust. For weeks, Anne had spoken like an official, measured, procedural, almost detached. But one private conversation finally broke through that discipline. What she allegedly heard convinced her that the dispute was becoming deeply personal, and that Harry now saw palace caution not as protection, but as betrayal. Harry's frustration had been building quietly, and when it finally surfaced, it struck at the heart of the palace's entire position. He reportedly challenged the idea that family access could be separated so neatly from royal status. Titles could change, duties could end. But family, he argued, was not an appointment that could simply be suspended by procedure. Anne understood more than he expected. She knew that affection could not be reduced to rules, and she reportedly acknowledged that the palace had sometimes hidden behind process when emotion became uncomfortable. But she would not let sympathy decide where institutional boundaries should sit. Then Harry raised Diana. The name changed everything. What had been a debate over status suddenly carried years of grief, memory, and unresolved anger. Harry allegedly argued that he had seen before what happened when the institution protected itself while individuals suffered inside it. To him, caution surrounding Meghan did not feel neutral. It felt familiar. Anne reportedly pushed back. Invoking Diana, she warned, created emotional pressure no official could answer fairly. Every restriction risked being compared to the past. Every disagreement could become proof that history was repeating itself. Yet the exchange exposed something deeper. Harry believed the palace's hesitation around Meghan revealed distrust. Anne believed allowing exceptions simply to avoid emotional confrontation would eventually damage everyone involved. They were arguing from different fears, and neither could fully accept the others. Meghan was not reportedly present, yet she became the center of the entire conversation. That fact unsettled Anne. So much of the conflict was now being shaped through assumptions, private reports, and indirect exchanges rather than honest conversation between the people most affected. For the first time, Anne reportedly questioned whether the palace itself had helped create the crisis. Perhaps her original warning had been right, but for the wrong reason. Perhaps the danger was not one individual challenging the monarchy. Perhaps it was an institution so uncomfortable with emotional ambiguity that it had replaced difficult conversations with rules, delays, and silence. That realization might have opened the door to compromise. But it came too late. Because while Anne was beginning to question the palace's methods, officials received information that appeared to confirm the very fear that had started everything. The palace had spent months treating Anne's warning as a matter of judgment. Then came the file. It contained no single devastating revelation, but when officials placed its contents in sequence, the pattern suddenly looked very different, and several people who had dismissed Anne were forced to reconsider. The file was reportedly less explosive than people might expect. There was no single document capable of destroying reputations. Instead, it brought together correspondence, unresolved requests, protocol disputes, conflicting assurances, and decisions that had previously been scattered across different palace offices. Separately, each looked manageable. Together, they exposed a cycle. A request would arrive. Officials would hesitate. One department might offer reassurance while another quietly imposed limits. Frustration would follow. Then came fear that private disagreement could leak, leading to even tighter restrictions. That, in turn, created fresh resentment. The pattern kept repeating. For Anne, this changed the meaning of her original warning. The problem was no longer simply whether Meghan had pushed too far or whether officials had been too rigid. It was that the system itself had become trapped in reaction. Every decision answered the immediate problem while making the next one more difficult. One advisor allegedly admitted what few wanted to say aloud: the palace had never decided what long-term relationship it actually wanted with Harry and Meghan. That uncertainty touched everything. Meghan appeared in the file as both participant and target. At times, she allegedly pressed for greater freedom and clearer recognition. At others, she reacted strongly to restrictions she believed were unfair. Harry's instinct was to defend her, but that protection transformed administrative disagreements into tests of family loyalty. Anne reportedly argued that the monarchy could no longer survive on vague understandings. Three things had to be defined: what access belonged to family, what privilege belonged only to official royal service, and who controlled the heritage attached to the crown. Then, officials reached the most sensitive part: future ceremonies. Funerals, memorials, weddings, state occasions. Moments where precedence, seating, procession, titles, jewels, and public roles could not simply be left undefined. One day, another major royal event would force choices into the open. That was when the room reportedly changed. Anne's warning could no longer be dismissed as excessive caution. The next crisis was not hypothetical. It was waiting somewhere in the future, and the palace would eventually have to choose. But before officials could establish those boundaries, one question threatened to split the family more deeply than any seating plan or palace invitation ever could. What did Harry believe was being kept from him? For Harry, the argument had never been merely about palace access. Beneath every restriction sat another question: Diana, her possessions, her memory, her treatment by the institution, and the fear that history was repeating itself. When that fear finally surfaced, Anne could no longer treat the crisis as administrative. Harry allegedly began raising questions about objects connected to his mother, private correspondence, sentimental possessions, jewelry, and pieces of personal history whose emotional value could never be measured in money. To him, these were not simply items preserved by royal tradition. They were fragments of a mother he had lost too young, and every decision surrounding them carried the weight of that loss. Anne reportedly rejected any suggestion that Diana's memory was being deliberately erased. But she could no longer deny that ownership and access had become dangerously emotional. One disputed keepsake, insignificant in financial terms, allegedly became the center of a much larger argument. The object itself almost stopped mattering. What mattered was what it represented: recognition, belonging, and whether Harry still had a meaningful claim to the personal history surrounding his mother. That made compromise painfully difficult. Harry was not approaching the issue like an administrator. He was approaching it as a son. Any restriction could feel like another separation. Any delay could resemble exclusion. And every reference to palace procedure risked awakening old resentment toward an institution he believed had already failed his mother once. Anne understood the emotional force of that comparison. She had known Diana inside the royal system. Yet she also feared that grief was now shaping present disputes in ways no rulebook could contain. Meghan's position made everything more volatile. Her supporters could see her as encouraging Harry to reclaim a voice he had suppressed for years. Critics inside this fictional palace feared something else: that Diana's legacy might gradually be redefined outside royal control, turning memory into another battlefield between the Sussexes and the institution. Anne reportedly made a difficult admission. Officials had underestimated how powerfully modern disagreements would reactivate Harry's unresolved pain. That realization led to a proposal nobody had previously wanted to make. Sentimental family possessions, Anne argued, should be treated separately from institutional royal assets. The distinction could protect both history and personal memory, but it would also force officials to answer questions they had avoided for decades. And buried beneath those questions was something even more dangerous. Anne's original warning had contained a prediction almost everyone had overlooked. And when officials returned to Anne's original words, they discovered that the most unsettling part of her warning had never been about jewels, invitations, or titles. It had been about what would happen when silence finally collapsed. Buried inside Anne's original warning was a prediction officials had reportedly considered too dramatic. If the palace refused to define its relationship with Harry and Meghan privately, the relationship would eventually be defined publicly, through competing narratives, and whichever version reached the public first would become almost impossible to undo. Now that prediction was beginning to feel less like caution and more like prophecy. Details of the internal disputes allegedly started moving beyond the small circle that had contained them. What had once been private disagreements over access, protocol, inheritance, and family expectations were becoming fragments of a much larger public story. The palace immediately divided over how to respond. Some advisors wanted firm denials. Others believed explanation was necessary before speculation hardened into accepted truth. A third group argued that silence remained the safest option, while another quietly pushed for greater distance from Harry and Meghan altogether. Every choice carried risk. Anne reportedly opposed silence without clarity. Silence, she argued, had once protected the institution because people assumed restraint meant control. Now it was doing the opposite. Every unanswered question created space for suspicion, and every delay allowed another interpretation to take hold. Harry saw the situation differently. To him, the circulation of private details appeared to prove that palace confidentiality had never been as dependable as he had been told. If deeply personal concerns could travel beyond closed doors, then why should he trust the system with anything more? Meghan allegedly reached an equally painful conclusion. She believed she would always be interpreted through palace structures, through advisors, briefings, rules, and competing explanations, rather than being allowed to define her own position. That was when senior officials finally understood the full meaning of Anne's warning. Every unresolved boundary had created two stories. There was the private version, shaped by protocol and internal reasoning. Then there was the public version, shaped by emotion, suspicion, and whichever explanation emerged first. Anne took no satisfaction in being proven right. The very outcome she had tried to prevent was now damaging the family she believed she was protecting. The monarchy faced an impossible balance. Protect the institution too aggressively, and personal relationships could collapse. Repair those relationships through exceptions, and the rules protecting the crown could begin to weaken. So one final meeting was reportedly called. Not to declare a winner, not to assign blame, but to answer a harder question: could any relationship survive if its boundaries remained undefined? The truth coming out had not ended the conflict. It had stripped away the ambiguity, leaving Anne, Harry, Meghan, and the palace with one final choice that could redefine their relationship for years. By the time the final meeting began, nobody could pretend this was one feud between two royal women. Anne's warning had exposed something larger: a monarchy struggling to decide whether family loyalty, institutional duty, inheritance, and personal freedom could still exist together when every private decision carried global consequences. Anne reportedly entered with a different purpose than before. She was no longer trying to prove that her concerns had been justified. That argument was over. What mattered now was whether the palace could create rules strong enough to prevent the same cycle from repeating. The first agreement was simple but significant. Family relationships and royal privilege could no longer be treated as the same thing. Harry could remain a son, brother, and uncle without automatically receiving every access point connected to official service. The same principle would apply consistently, not according to personal approval. From there, the most sensitive areas were addressed: ceremonial roles, residences, archives, jewels, institutional resources. Each would reportedly be governed by clearer boundaries rather than last-minute negotiation. Diana-related possessions required something different. Anne allegedly argued that grief could not be processed like palace inventory. Sentimental items tied directly to family memory needed special consideration, even when legal ownership remained complicated. That concession mattered to Harry, though it did not give him everything he wanted. For the first time, officials also acknowledged their own role in the breakdown. Mixed messages, delayed decisions, and contradictory assurances had deepened suspicion. Harry's anger had not emerged in a vacuum, and Meghan was no longer treated as the single explanation for everything that had gone wrong. The deeper truth was more uncomfortable. Personality had collided with grief. Tradition had collided with independence. Media pressure had magnified private tension, while unclear rules had turned ordinary disagreements into symbolic battles. Anne's warning was finally understood in a different light. It had not been a campaign against Meghan. It had been an attempt to stop unresolved personal conflict from hardening into permanent institutional fracture. But rules could not repair everything. Trust had already been damaged. Old wounds had been reopened. And even after boundaries were clarified, every future invitation, heirloom, memorial, and family gathering would carry the memory of what had happened before. The final truth was not one hidden file or one explosive confrontation. It was that the palace had understood the danger much earlier than the public ever knew. And although those doors eventually opened again, what happened behind them changed the meaning of every future invitation. Every inherited jewel, every family appearance, and every silence that followed.